Good evening, and thank you for joining us. I'm Trey Gowdy, and it's Sunday night in America. Here we go again. Former President Donald Trump versus current President Joe Biden. Will Grover Cleveland have company in the history books, or will Joe Biden overcome historically low poll numbers? There are blinking caution lights for both candidates while the American people settle in for what looks like the longest general election in history. That general election started in earnest last night during the State of the Union. Talk of unity from his inaugural address years ago is gone. This was talk about contrast, not conciliation.
My predecessor, a former Republican president, tells Putin, quote, "Do whatever the hell you want." My predecessor came to office determined to see Roe v. Wade overturned. He's the reason it was overturned. My predecessor, and many in this chamber, want to take this prescription drug away by repealing the Affordable Care Act. I'm not going to let that happen. And if my predecessor is watching, instead of paying politics and pressuring members of Congress to block the bill, join me in telling the Congress to pass it.
Joining us now are Fox News contributors Charlie Hurt and Marie Harf. Welcome to you both. Marie, there was a policy aspect to the speech for sure, and there was a performance aspect. Did he move voters within his own party on the policy part of it? And did he assuage concerns about his mental acuity with independents or other voters?
You know, I think he did. And a lot of Democrats were very nervous. They wouldn't admit it publicly, but they were very nervous leading up to this speech. He was basically, on fire. He was fired up. He was really in the details of policy. He was going back and forth, engaging with Republicans. I think there were a lot of people that thought Joe Biden would come out there and be sleepy and not really engaged, make a lot of mistakes. And he did the opposite, Trey. He came out and gave a really fiery speech. He was engaged in the details. And I think a lot of Democrats after that speech feel very good about the contrast. Because look, do voters think he's too old? Of course they do. But they saw him in that speech be engaged and energetic and paint a real contrast with his opponent, who also isn't always in control of the facts when he speaks. So Democrats feel really good sitting here today about the policy and the optics, both of which matter, as you know.
And now we have the handsome Hurt brother, Charlie. Biden mentioned unity more times than any other president when he was sworn in. Hadn't heard much about it since then, but former President Trump has spoken a lot recently about unity within his party.
It was the most caustic, partisan, vitriolic State of the Union address that I have ever witnessed. I've seen, I've covered over 20 of them in my career covering politics. I've never seen anything like it. I think that Marie is right in terms of, he came out swinging. I don't know what they gave him before he came out. Whatever it was, I would like a shot of it myself. But it was over the top. He was squinting. He was angry. He was vicious. And I'm sure that a lot of Democrats, a lot of partisan Democrats who don't care about the issues and don't care about the American people were thrilled with that performance, because what they saw was a partisan fighter, a street fighter. And I think that Republicans should be warned that this is the guy they're going to get. They're going to get this nasty fighter who is willing to say anything in order to win. And I think it's instructive for Republicans to realize that. The problem is he's talking about things like Ukraine. He's talking about all of these things that nobody in America actually cares about. He didn't talk about, or hardly talked about, or lied about issues like illegal immigration that is, because of his policies, is leading to the death and rape of Americans. He didn't talk about in any real way the economy or housing costs and all of these things that his policies have made worse for people. And so if that's the contrast, the race is over. Donald Trump is going to win this thing, because Donald Trump is going to win on those issues.
All right, Marie, there were national calls for change in the aftermath of James Byrd Jr.'s murder, Matthew Shepard, George Floyd, Trayvon Martin, Tyree Nichols. The president did make reference to Laken Riley. But does he need to do more through executive action or some other means that doesn't require Congress? Because he seems like he's underwater on that issue. And I think the murder of Laken Riley is going to continue to be an issue throughout this election.
Well, immigration is certainly an issue. It's interesting, Trey. In our last Fox News poll, more Americans actually blame Congress for the lack of action at the border than they blame Joe Biden. But Democrats and the White House need to take this issue seriously. He made a case in the State of the Union that he has put on the table the toughest border bill that any Democrat would ever agree to. Republicans were begging for this bill. He agreed to it, and then for political reasons, to help Donald Trump, Republicans in Congress walked away from it. That's what he needs to keep saying over and over and over again. That's the way to actually, bring down wait times to expel people from the country, get more judges to adjudicate these. That's a case they need to keep making. But I think they should also be considering executive action here, because these are horrifying stories that we hear. They tug at the heartstrings of voters, which we know really matters. And voters care a lot about immigration, Trey. But he also talked about women's health. He did talk about the economy and housing costs. He talked about a lot of issues that voters really care about, and Republicans sat there. I mean, you've sat in that chamber during these speeches. They sat there and, in my opinion, looked like they weren't a serious party, yelling, jeering, screaming, not really coming forward with a lot of policy proposals of their own, even in the rebuttal.
I slept a lot in that chamber. I'm not sure how much I sat and listened. Some of them were pretty lengthy. Charlie, before I let you go, does former President Trump need Nikki Haley voters? And if he needs them, how does he get them? And I'll let you take us out with that one.
Sure, he does. And the way he's going to get them is by talking about these issues that Joe Biden has ignored or has completely screwed up. Of course, the tough bill that Marie mentions is a bill put forward by House Republicans, and all that bill was the policies that Donald Trump had in place, the Trump border wall that solved the crisis at the border that Joe Biden used executive action to undo, to create the open borders and the crisis that we have. The problem, the reason that Republicans didn't go along with that bill is because Democrats refused to accept that bill and instead insisted that they would only accept it if it included billions of dollars for Ukraine and the war in Gaza.
God bless you both for joining us for what is going to be the longest general election in the history of mankind. We will see you both soon.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.